sorry, I've got to allow Zoom to share my screen. Apparently, I didn't set that up.
Oh, okay.
1 second.
No worry.
There's something. Now, okay, it says I have to quit and reopen. I'll be right back.
Okay. In the meantime, just a reminder to some people in the chat. Remember, if you're trying to message everyone in the room to change the chat, like there's a blue box, change it to panelists and attendees. Otherwise, you'll be talking just to the panelists and the moderators. It's just a detail. I see some miscommunication happening because of that. And yeah, that's it. Let's just wait for Amy to come back. Okay. Hello, Amy.
Hi again. Sorry. Okay. Is it working now?
Yep.
Awesome. All right. Sorry about that. Thanks for having me. Sorry about the delay. I want to start with a quick acknowledgement that I'm joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The land acknowledgement is pretty standard in Canadian events, and I thought it was important today given some of what I'm talking about. So my title is less a title and more of something I hope we get to talk about during discussion. Medievalism studies has really taken off over the last few years, and its popularity coincides with the rise of white supremacy, fascism, and the far right in politics around the world. Studying medievalism used to be a marginalized pursuit, but nowadays even the most traditional medieval scholars have become adept at spotting medievalism out in the wild, especially when it's wielded by white supremacists. But what I want to consider today is whether we've fallen into the habit of using the term medievalism when something more complicated is going on. And if so, what can we do to expand our critical framework? So I'm going to talk about this guy who's become fairly famous among medievalists. The initial academic response to the attack on the US Capitol in January sparked a surge of articles about medievalism. Most people focused on this guy who goes by Jake Angeli, also known as the Q shaman. Medievalists flagged his Norse tattoos and Viking helmet as misuses of medieval history, and medieval studies organizations even put out statements to denounce the use of these symbols. But just as quickly, Indigenous scholars like Joseph Pearce corrected the Viking label, explaining that Angeli's headdress wasn't medieval, it was Indigenous American cultural appropriation. And a quick Google search on Jake Angeli would have revealed that he says his look is inspired by Indigenous cultures. The guy even calls himself the Yellowstone Wolf and teaches shamanistic studies courses online. The medievalist response, maybe even overreaction to Angeli's overall look, is a great example of how scholars, in our haste to identify and correct medievalisms wherever they lurk, can create new problems. For one thing, if we swallow everything about Angeli up under the label of alt-right Viking medievalism, we're in real danger of replicating his colonization of Indigenous traditions. For another, sticking our flag in everything that looks or smells medieval can actually weaken our understanding of modern extremism. When medievalism did appear at January's Capitol attack, it was in conversation with other important symbols: a Camp Auschwitz hoodie, Confederate flags, Spartan helmets, Molon Lave tattoos, Punisher skulls, even the Outsider tattoo from the game Dishonored. What this looks like at first is just postmodern pastiche, people throwing cool pieces of history onto themselves to see what sticks. But really, images like this are dialogic. The symbols are interdependent, and they create meaning through that interdependence. In these images, medievalism doesn't and can't stand alone. It's part of a larger and more disturbing narrative, one that, for lack of a better term, I've taken to calling white history. Mostly thanks to this guy. Somebody tweeted something nice about my book with Paul Sturdivant, and this guy showed up in the comments. And before I blocked him, I realized he had given me a pretty productive term. White history works, because if we look at the imagery from the attack on the Capitol, white history is precisely the story that these terrorists are telling themselves. They're celebrating their own imagined Spartan / Norse / Templar / Confederate / Nazi legacy. White history doesn't bother to delineate historical periodization the way we do in the academy. White history collapses time and geography and culture to form its own mythic narrative. There's also a lot to be said about how the rioters created a pan-historical narrative of masculinity, but I don't have a lot of time to talk about that today, so I'll stay focused. The January 6th terrorists were radicals, but white history isn't just a fringe thing. It's had plenty of institutional support. Most education in the US until very recently could have been called white history. The stereotype of extremists is that they're ignorant and uneducated, but that isn't always the case. A lot of what they think they know about history was taught to them in school, from elementary school to university, and in textbooks or on history TV. And all the modern academic revelations about the past, all the new scholarship on global history and ancient and medieval diversity is usually trapped behind a paywall. If medievalism matters in our analysis of the Capitol attack, I'd argue that it can only be understood in a larger context, in conversation with Indigenous appropriation, the fetishization of Sparta, superhero capes, the Confederate flag, and the American one. In the narrative constructed by these symbols, white history is powerful, but it's also precious, precarious, and threatened. Since time is short, I want to focus on this one particular facet of white history, its obsession with and fear of loss. Specifically, I want to talk about something called the Great Replacement. The Great Replacement theory posits that there's a global conspiracy to wipe out white people. Jews, or globalists, if people are being polite, or sometimes Muslims, are supposedly the architects of the Great Replacement, manipulating politics and world events to dethrone and wipe out white people. The myth that Jews are trying to destroy Western civilization has been around a long time. One of Hitler's many anti-Jewish rants in Mein Kampf claims that the Jews had, quote, the clear aim of ruining the white race, throwing it down from its cultural and political height, and himself rising to be the master, end quote. The European obsession with being replaced was one of the factors that led to the Holocaust. Fear-mongering over the disappearance of white people and so-called white culture has also been reinforced by the American state. In the early 20th century, white America's desire to lay claim to a, quote, Anglo-Saxon heritage meant violence and discrimination against Black Americans, Jews, Muslims, Asians, Latinos, and even Irish and Italian immigrants. Limits were placed on how many non-Anglo-Saxon immigrants were allowed in the country. Japanese Americans were locked in internment camps, and boats full of Jews were sent back to die in concentration camps during World War II. Modern extremists have rediscovered the Great Replacement theory, and they've been crying about the declining white birth rate and a so-called demographic winter for more than 3 decades. The theory has gone mainstream in American, British, and European conservatism. Every time you see a think piece on underpopulation and how we need more babies, it's almost always from someone who is also anti-immigration and against foreign aid. And when they say more babies, they mean more white babies. Fear of the so-called Great Replacement was the reason for Trump's wall, and the reason his administration separated parents from their children and kept them in horrific conditions. And it's the reason for all the anti-diversity measures he signed into law in the twilight months of his presidency. And of course, the Great Replacement theory is back in the news this very month, with American Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene calling for a return to Anglo-Saxon heritage. The Great Replacement theory has also fueled violence and terrorism over the last decade. The white nationalists who rioted in Charlottesville in 2017 and shouted, "You will not replace us," and "Jews will not replace us," believed in the Great Replacement theory. Robert Bowers murdered 11 Jewish people at a synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018 because he believed that Jews were funding a caravan of refugees from South America. The 2019 Christchurch shooter, who targeted Muslims in New Zealand, even called his manifesto the Great Replacement and warned of a genocide against white people. The same year, John T. Ernest attacked a California synagogue, and his manifesto claimed that Jews were using immigrants and Black Americans to destroy the white race. So how does Jake Angeli, self-proclaimed shaman, whose shirtless image at the Capitol so enthralled and horrified the American public, connect to the Great Replacement theory? If we dismiss his getup as a bad facsimile of a Viking, we'll never find out. We have to dig deeper into the conversation between Angeli's appropriation of indigenous culture, his tattoo of Trump's border wall, which is what's on his arm, his tattoo of Yggdrasil, a Valknot, and this blob that is probably Thor's hammer. For Angeli, the power of his Norse tattoos isn't because they're from the Middle Ages. The tattoos are part of a long and timeless narrative of lost power, and they, like the indigenous traditions he stole, promise a return not to the medieval past, but to something even older, a connection between man and nature that can't be contained by something as petty as chronology. His brand of white supremacy merges all pagan and indigenous spirituality together into white magic, and I mean that both figuratively and literally. When asked by the National Review to explain his outfit, Angeli said it's meant to, quote, chase off evil spirits, evil sorcerers, and evil witches, satanic warlocks, and stuff like that, who might attempt to infiltrate our movement, end quote. Angeli's appropriation of indigeneity is not only more important than his medievalism, it's at the forefront of his identity. He's longing for an imagined prehistory, not medieval history. That longing is the fire that fuels violence, not just for Angeli, but for scores of white supremacist environmentalists, some of whom have turned into mass murderers. And I did just say white supremacist environmentalists, because following the pattern of other eco-friendly QAnon adherents with a penchant for appropriating indigeneity, Angeli may have started out on the political left and become enamored with an ideology called ecofascism. Eco-fascists are against multiculturalism, immigration, and globalization because they think these things destroy the environment. They believe in a return to nature, idealizing and appropriating what they see as pure cultural traditions connected to the land. The Christchurch shooter was an eco-fascist, and so was the 2019 El Paso shooter, who targeted Mexican Americans and named his manifesto An Inconvenient Truth after the environmentalist documentary. According to Jason Wilson, writing for The Guardian in 2019, there's a thriving online eco-fascist subculture that, quote, looks forward to and even talks about accelerating the end of industrial civilization. It dreams of a return to a blood and soil relationship between peoples and territories, and of a post-collapse society which will restore the authority of white men, end quote. If this all sounds a little bit Nazi, that's because the Nazis believed there was mythic power to be found in the prehistoric past, power tied to the land that could help them fight Jews and strengthen the white race. Hence the expression blood and soil, which implies a supernatural connection between a people and their land. They claim that the suppression of Norse folklore had led to a decline of the West, and that restoring ancient wisdom could save Germany from cultural decay. The Nazis looked for the Holy Grail and ancient Norse runes, but they also colonized traditions that didn't belong to Germanic or even Norse heritage. They had a particular penchant for co-opting and appropriating indigeneity in all its forms. It seems counterintuitive, but the long-running Nazi narrative was of a homogeneous Aryan race with its tentacles rooted in all cultures all over the world, hence their co-opting of the swastika. Today's eco-fascists also exploit indigenous cultures and merge them together without distinction. White supremacists are obsessed with the Norse gods, but also with the Celts, and with the movie Braveheart, but also with appropriating First Nations and Native American sacred objects. Eco-fascists are into veganism and white supremacy, recycling and anti-Semitism, indigenous spirituality and Norse mythology, organic food and guns. These seeming contradictions are especially evident among extremist women who brew their own kombucha, grow vegetables, sage their houses, and sponsor white baby challenges for their YouTube followers. All this seems like a contradiction, but it's a contradiction that is at the heart of understanding radicalization today. As you can see from these images, a lot of the symbolism at the Capitol attack revolved around loss, Sparta, the Confederacy, the Templars, paganism, all power that has disappeared. The terrorists who attack the Capitol don't think of themselves as privileged, despite freely carrying weapons and having the cooperation of several Congress members and the former president and his administration. Instead, they think they've lost privileges and rights. At the risk of being flipped, the terrorists who attack the Capitol don't think they're the bad guys. They think they're the resistance. If we're content to file Angeli's various appropriations under typical alt-right medievalism, we're missing a real opportunity to understand how and why people get radicalized. If we're only looking on the political right for extremism and white supremacy, we're going to miss the QAnon train picking up people on the left. And finally, and this one is especially important for medievalists, if we only look at medieval misappropriations when we talk about extremism in the classroom or in our conversations with the public or with each other, we run the risk of perpetuating our own narrative of white history, one in which the European medieval past is the only past that matters. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy, for the great presentation as always. And without further ado, I will move on to our next panelist, which is Professor Carlile Lanzieri from UFMT, which is the Federal University of Mato Grosso here in Brazil. Carlile, with you.
Can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yes.
As you know it, my English is not my first language, but I try to do my best. I promise. So as Luis said, my name is Carlile Lanzieri Jr. I'm a professor at the Universidade Federal do Mato Grosso, in English, Mato Grosso Federal University, or something like this. First of all, I'd like to say thanks to Luis and Vinicius for inviting me. It's an honor. And I'd like to say to Amy Kaufman and then Daniel Wollenberg, it's an honor to be here with you, sharing this round table. My paper, the paper that I will present for you, it's a little part of my new book. Its title in Portuguese is Cavaleiros de Cola, Papel e Plástico. The title in English is Knights of Glue, Paper and Plastic. The title of my paper is the Negationist Pact and Mythologization of the Medieval Past. I will read it for you, but I need to share my slides. Can you see? Luis, please, can you see it? Can you see them?
Yeah, we can.
Okay.
We can see.
Okay.
They are not full screen. Is that correct?
Okay. Is that okay now?
Yeah.
So let's go. On the morning of August 12, 2017 year, in the small and then unknown Charlottesville, a city in Virginia located 200 kilometers southwest of Washington, a crowd of hundreds took to the central streets, predominantly white young people, and united under the motto "Unite the Right." A good part of those present held with pride the old flag of the Confederate States, shouting slogans, several of them of a supremacist nature. However, Charlottesville's image that soon took over the world indicated something more than just a local feud in what happened that day. Besides the mentioned flags, that something more tells us a lot. In the view of Paulo Pachá is a Brazilian researcher What happened that morning can be considered the defining moment of new nostalgic perceptions about the medieval past. In his opinion, the open-air dispute over whether or not to remove General Lee's statue from a square in the center of the city brought to the light and in an organized manner all those people who exposed their certainties about a medieval past to the world. A past which they believe that be heirs of in the form of shields, helmets, and swords made of glue, paper, and plastic. In this sense, the struggle fought over the memory of one of the heroes of that country's history has only become a background issue. On September 23rd, 2020 year, in a live stream held by Linhas in English, Lines study group on narratives and medievalisms mediated by Professor Plínio Amaral and Luis of the book The Devil, Historians and Kaufman, and Paul Sturtevant also mentioned what happened on the streets of Little Charlottesville just over 3 years ago. For both, what happened in the North American territory served as to dispel the myth that the people who think and describe or consume the medieval past like that would be just lone wolves. They were not. They are not. Still, for Kaufman and Sturtevant, understanding and facing this new nationalism with integrist features is among the great challenges of the medievalists and other researchers of the beginning of the 21st century. If in the United States and several countries in Europe there are those who dress up to appear in public and defend their ideas taken by supremacist feelings of an identical nature that embrace the medieval in search of legitimacy, in Brazil something similar is happening. In order to better delimit this problem in the domestic sphere and give context to our central issue, we will highlight two episodes that occurred in the first half of 2020 year. Although without a direct relationship at first, both have similarities that must be analyzed based on the context in which the uses of medieval past reappear with renewed strength. This resurgence takes place with explicit political and ideological objectives that say a lot about the current power relationships that govern our country and have guided a significant portion of public debates for at least 2 or 3 years. The first of these occurred a few days before the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 pandemic. More precisely, between March 5th and 7th, 2020, a night, Brazil, a night with a shield and the Brazilian flag in hand, galloped with white steed to summon patriots to acts to be performed on March 15th in favor of President Jair Bolsonaro. With the touch of a march in a martial tone in the background and a speech mixing phrases with Portuguese words sprinkled with brief Latin expressions, the video of just over a minute and a half in length so spread through the social networks to promote read debates among Brazilian medievalists. The second episode, on the other hand, occurred with the pandemic in progress and with the number of the deaths and contaminants growing every day. In it, the controversial blogger and self-declared conservative YouTuber Alan dos Santos, this guy, in a live stream held on the night of May 29th, Trent, raised a glass of pure milk and drank it quickly, act promptly repeated by the other participants who shared the table and the transmission with him. An addiction identical to that of President Bolsonaro himself on a live stream performed by him a little earlier on that same date. For some time now, the seemingly ordinary act of Santos and Bolsonaro has been pointed out by experts as a gesture to symbolize white superiority. In addition to the questionable gesture of Alan Santos, that gives rise to different interpretations. What also caught our attention is the composition of the scene around the blogger. A small flag from the Brazilian imperial period, this flag, pictures with images of personalities linked to the right wing and here the right wing and conservative though, like the ideologist Olavo de Carvalho. This screen. Busts, many bugs. Among these bugs, just above Santos' high shoulder, it's possible to identify by the green spine. Just one moment. Green spine, some of the volumes of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, published in 2016 by Ecclesia, a Brazilian published company, alongside other books that appear to be those published with support from Institute Hill of St. Victor, which, among other products, also sells humanities, Latin, Greek, and liberal arts courses on its website. As stated in the previous paragraph, the edition of Summa Theologica on the bookshelf at the back of the room where the live stream was held is by Ecclesia Publishing Company. This is an exquisite version in Portuguese conducted by Alexandre Correia during the first half of the last century, which today serves as material for consultation and research by the specialized public. In addition to the Summa Theologica, Ecclesia Publishing Company is also responsible for publishing translations of other medieval masters, almost all of them related to the patristics and scholasticism. A quick search on this publisher's website allows us to discover that his works are not linked to the publication of this type of translation. In addition to several books aimed to the Catholic public, there are works by names linked to conservative and anti-communist thinking. We don't know whether Alan dos Santos actually read the Summa Theologica, or if he's a researcher of the writings of the Agnate or a mere enthusiast of Thomistic Though. However, his channel and his close relationship with characters from the Brazilian conservative field who maintain a very peculiar and moral view of what was the medieval, it's possible to conclude that the presence of bugs in that environment helps to compose open quotation marks, medieval intellectual aesthetics, close quotation marks, that serves as a critic of what they define as indoctrinated education that for decades has supposedly spread within Brazilian schools and universities, especially public ones. Specializing in works aimed at the Christian public, Ecclesia is not alone in this increasingly busy market with a growing number of consumers. Among them is Kirion. Kirion is another Brazilian publishing company. Kirion is responsible for the publication in Portuguese of works focused on classical education or related themes, also giving great prominence to ancient and medieval authors. Among them is Hugh of St. Vitor's Didascalicon, some sort of flagship of their publications. Recently, Kirion also invested in the reissue of Rui Afonso da Costa Nunes books. Rui Afonso da Costa Nunes is an old Brazilian researcher. Among them, the books, the Costa Nunes books, history, the first book, History of Education in the Middle Ages, and the second book, Genesis, Meaning, and the Teaching of Philosophy in the 12th century, works that were out of print for some decades. Although apparently disconnected, these events, as well as several others that we could mention here, say a lot about the construction of a kind of virtual global memory that consumes and resignifies the medieval in contemporary times for political media purposes. This happens even in Brazil, a country that has not lived through the Middle Ages, but that seeks to connect it to it above all because the Christian religion and its monarchical past. Most of the time, this reinterpretation of the past emerges as a saving alternative to today's degenerate culture. In this sense, the adherents of such certainties believe that they are facing a new end of the history from which a new society will emerge, guided by values that were once lost. Thus, we believe that the basic problem to be dealt with from the examples offered is not to understand how it was truly medieval or how the analysis produced respects or not the medieval sources, but to understand how situations not experienced in the medieval are today forcibly placed under an archetype medieval. In a complementary way with its characters and events, the Middle Ages presented in this type of narrative comes to the fore as a mythical time, not as a historical time. With regard once again to the Brazilian cases so far cited, it's important to note that such uses have served to support the criticism of members of the current government who see the educational system dominated by left-wing agendas. Almost all adherents of such beliefs trust that the recovery of authority would be a way to rescue the values of family and homeland lost in our society. Indeed, the medieval master, surrounded by a retinue of disciples and the armed knight, ready to fight in the company of others like him, appear as figures who are bound to endorse the resumption of a homogeneous society based on religious, hierarchical, and patriarchal values. In this case, a past described as perfect due to its unitary and pure character becomes too north for the construction of the future. In relation to the listed episodes, it's interesting to note that the reference to medieval education go basically until the beginning of the 13th century, a period in which the first universities appeared. Apparently, the failure to overcome this chronological barrier is a strategic choice that reinforces the interest in an education referenced by the unique and direct contact between teachers and disciples, and also guided by strict ethical and religious values. The restoration of this education is the objective of those who orbit around these groups and characters who are also critical of the Brazilian public universities, but without considering that they have a recent history in a country marked by historical inequalities and difficulties in assessing education, especially higher education. So what to do? This is the last paragraph of my paper. And I think this is the one million or $1 billion question. What to do? I don't have the correct or the definitive answer, but I think this is a possible answer. We believe that thinking about public history that dialogues with the demands of the general public, that shows itself not only as a history of the present, but also as a history of the questions of the present, and of how it invades the past in the name of invented ideologies and memories, compose the answer to the question that heads this paragraph, this last paragraph. The hope is that this search will gain consistency, that we will finally be able to occupy other and new spaces in addition to our air-conditioned rooms, and use the new languages that the digital humanities are gradually offering us. So, in a complementary way, but not any less important, we hope that in the same way, we will be able to understand how knowledge circulates in different public environments, be it real or virtual, and intervene in them more frequently and less formally. Thanks.
Thank you, Khalili. So now I will pass to Professor Daniel Woolenberg from the University of Tampa.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, these have been really good talks. I appreciate everything that's been said. Hopefully my talk kind of meshes. I think it does with both of your talks. I will say that I don't have visuals. I hope that's okay. It's just, we've seen a bunch of Confederate flags already, and hopefully you can just sort of imagine a Confederate flag there. I don't do that, but if hopefully my face entertains you for 15 minutes is what I'm saying. Okay. So this is what I'm talking about today is an article that I've written for an edited collection that's forthcoming at some point, COVID. It's called Engaging the Crusades, the Memory and Legacy of Crusading is what the series is called. It's published by Routledge. The volume that this piece will appear in is called The Crusades and the Far Right in the 21st Century. The title of my chapter is called One Foot in Europe and the Other Foot in Dixie, Neo-Confederates, Holy War and the Crusades. And basically it studies connections between Neo-Confederacy and medievalism in the US. I don't usually work on the United States directly all that much. And it was kind of nice in a way, I guess, to think about my own country, but not a very nice subject, I suppose. So the piece that I'm writing discusses Confederate and Neo-Confederate discourse about the US Civil War as a holy war, and draws connections between the Crusades and crusading in the way that the US Civil War was envisioned by some Southern writers, like in the 19th century, and Neo-Confederates now, long after the war, as a new kind of crusade. So the article's scope actually goes beyond medievalism, so I've generally left those parts out here, and I'll just focus on the medievalism aspects of the article. I tend to talk too much, so hopefully I'll get through all of this, but just let me know if I'm kind of talking too much, and I'll get to the good parts. Okay, so despite being over a century old, books by the Neo-Confederate author Thomas Dixon Jr., whose racist novel The Klansman was the source for the racist movie The Birth of a Nation, these novels still reflect some of the kind of major ideas and canards of Neo-Confederates today, both in the in the KKK and in other white supremacist groups, many of whom want to be thought of as kind of like incarnations of chivalric Christian soldiers defending, civilization, big quotes there, against outsiders, which for them means, liberals, LGBTQ people, individuals, Muslims, Jews, Americans of color. 21st century neo-Confederates fashioning themselves as Christian soldiers defending America and Western civilization, obviously, again, quotes around that, maintain a way of thinking that can be traced from the mid-19th century, which holds that the US Civil War was a holy war fought between a kind of pious South and a heretical or atheistic or godless North. That holy war is portrayed in neo-Confederate thought, both in the 19th century and still today, as having been fought to defend authentic Christian traditionalism in the South. And Southern soldiers then and neo-Confederate activists and extremists now are often portrayed in neo-Confederate rhetoric and imagery as holy warriors. So the Crusades as a series of Christian holy wars are thus aligned in neo-Confederate thought, sometimes explicitly, other times implicitly, with the US Civil War. So basically, my essay, in short, argues that the Civil War in the US is positioned in neo-Confederate thought as a modern crusade, and that revisionist views of the Crusades as necessary defenses of Christian homelands rather than what I strongly feel they really were, which was aggressively invasive wars against Muslims, Jews, pagans, and heterodox Christians, are grafted by neo-Confederate apologists onto the Civil War. So the rhetoric of holy war and pious soldiers and heretics and infidels that was deployed during the Civil War continues to proliferate among neo-Confederates today. And basically, like, long story short, the Civil War plays a similar role that the Crusades have played for the far and extreme right in the US, Europe, and Australia. So what is neo-Confederacy? Basically, it's a spectrum of beliefs from a relatively broad range of groups and individuals without a kind of unified singular vision or message. At its core, to be neo-Confederate is to be an apologist for the Confederacy. That's kind of a short way of putting it. Neo-Confederacy arose in the decades after the end of the Civil War and has had resurgences at various points in the last century. At each point, it reflects historical revisionism and its nostalgia for an old South that was hierarchical and deeply Christian and that offered social harmony for all, so they claim, of course, with whites in power and Black slaves content to be permanently and forcibly subjected to poverty, suffering, and violence. In short, neo-Confederates' core set of beliefs are grounded in the lost cause myth, white nationalism, white heritage, states' rights, and what they would view as, quote, traditional Christian values. So in its broadest application, neo-Confederacy entails any embrace of the Confederacy, right? From wearing a Confederate flag patch to otherwise displaying the battle flag to defending the myth of the lost cause in any capacity. The most intense and explicit neo-Confederate discourse today espouses outright racism, hate-fueled violence, and full-blown calls for another Southern secession from the Union. It covers a really broad range of beliefs, but white supremacy and white nationalism are constants on the spectrum of neo-Confederacy. There have been a few surges of neo-Confederate activity in the past century and a half since the end of the war, most notably in the 1890s, the 1920s, and right now, essentially. And it's essentially been going on right now since the mid-1990s that there's been a kind of upsurge in what I would call neo-Confederate thought and discourse. This probably goes without saying, but I suppose I'll note that they also espouse virulent anti-Islamic, anti-Semitic, racist, sexist, and homophobic beliefs. Or even if they don't openly say these things, they align with groups and individuals who do, right? So as people who self-style as defenders of, quote, traditional Christian values, the Crusades, or to be more precise, a common misrepresentation among those on the political right of the Crusades as a necessary defense of Christendom against aggressive Islamic armies. I'm saying that's the revisionist position. The Crusades are then a logical historical point for neo-Confederates to latch onto. Crusaders, or like, popular conceptions of them, combine two crucial elements that neo-Confederates revere, which is displays of Christian piety and red-blooded masculinity embodied in the image of the Crusader Knight. The most well-known Confederates, Neo-Confederate Knights, are of course like the so-called Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Who style their costumes to look generally like sort of like medieval Templar Knights. Since the 19th century, continuing an argument made before and during the Civil War by slave owners and proponents of the chattel slavery system, many Neo-Confederates have interpreted the Civil War as a holy war between true Christians and the heretical Union Army. So the core beliefs today of Neo-Confederates about masculine physical strength and female purity and honor and a rigid social hierarchy and chivalry were cultivated in the 19th century by white Southerners inspired by the Middle Ages. These so-called medieval values, as white Southerners saw them, promoted moral certainty and were in contradistinction to the individualist and godless North, which stood for moral relativity, obviously, as they saw it, as Southerners saw it. It was common for white Southerners in the 19th century, as well as 20th century scholars sympathetic to Neo-Confederacy and the lost cause myth, like Richard Weaver and Eugene Genovese, in particular in the 20th century, to link proclamations about honor and nobility among chivalric white Southerners with the chivalry of medieval knights. The medieval ideal of chivalry has long been cast as playing a fundamental role in shaping the values of the white Southern gentleman. And both the 19th century South and medieval Western European societies were idealized by Confederates and Neo-Confederates as being virtuous and idealistic at their core, despite the absurdity of making such an argument about a society, of course, that permitted the enslavement of humans. Slaveholders idealized chivalry and the chivalric gentleman to cover their inhumane and immoral actions as slaveholders. Proclamations about Confederate gentility and chivalry were and remain ultimately, of course, bogus justifications, papering over the brutal atrocities of slavery in America. Whether willfully cruel or blind and deaf to the abhorrence of their actions, many male slaveholders perceived themselves as knightly Christian men protecting idealized women and protecting the right to hold slaves. So I mentioned his name just now, but for someone like Eugene Genovese, a scholar like him, he died 10 years ago or so, like in 2012. 19th century Southerners shared with chivalric knights the desire to combine, quote, gentleness, humility, and fierceness in battle. And Genovese sees chivalry, primarily the protection of white women and the disempowered, as a civilizing force that white Southerners inherited from medieval knights. Without those chivalric ideals, Genovese argues, slaveholders would have been even more perverse, even more inhumane. Even if Southern soldiers, quote, often failed to live up to their professional standards, Genovese says, so did chivalric knights in the Crusades, he writes, who professed to walk a Christian path while not always staying on it. However, just because the ideal was not always practiced does not mean that we should dismiss the, quote, this is Genovese still, effect of the chivalric ideal on the lives of white men who aspire to fame or simply to think of themselves as decent. End of quote. In this account, chivalry is thus accepted as a flawed but crucial component of the white male, of the Southern mindset and the Southern character overall, of course, white Southern character. All things considered, these Confederate soldier and the slaveholder alike really were, for Genovese, bastions of chivalric values that were a throwback to a time long past. How am I doing on time, Louise? Am I halfway through, more?
You have 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to skip this paragraph then. Basically, this paragraph talked about like 19th century representations of what Genovese was saying. I'm going to skip that. Okay, so in the past 25 years, neo-Confederate extremists have embraced the framework of an unbridgeable religious divide between North and South. The white supremacist politics of groups like Identity Dixie and the League of the South are extremist points on the long historical arc of the long cause myth and the view among neo-Confederates that the Civil War was a holy war. The Theological War Thesis, which is complicated, but basically it's like the US Civil War was a holy war, basically. So the Theological War Thesis is deployed by contemporary neo-Confederate white hate groups as a never-ending racial and cultural war between Christian chivalric soldiers against, quote, assaults by the left. In this warped and perverse view of American politics, it's white Southerners, or really like rural white Southerners in general, who are a targeted group, while ethnic, racial, and religious minorities enjoy endless unearned privileges, according to this warped and perverse view, I'm saying. So basically, neo-Confederates today construct a crucial link between the perceived advantages of the pre-modern world and the perceived disadvantages of the modern world. So in neo-Confederate thought, the South, the US South, is the heir to pre-modern European social structures that were, quote, naturally hierarchical, patriarchal, racially determined, and far superior to the present. In the aspect of the lost cause myth that associates the North with an alienating, industrializing modernity and the South with traditionalism, the Middle Ages serve as a kind of ideal analog and model of a patriarchal and hierarchical fantasy world. In this traditionalist patriarchal fantasy of the Middle Ages, people knew their place. Whites were unquestionably privileged and socially and politically superior, and white men were obligated to protect white women who were virtuous and chaste and not only required, but relished such male physical protection. So the South in this view is a monolithic, timeless extension of the idealized static world of the European Middle Ages, which featured masculine, chivalric Christian soldier knights ready to defend their homes and families at all costs. So heritage medievalism is a crucial component of contemporary neo-Confederate discourse, as you might imagine. So a group like the Sons of Confederate Veterans, for example, are a, quote, heritage group, obviously heritage in quotes, that formed in the late 19th century, whose primary purposes are historical revisionism and white identity politics, painting the Confederacy in a positive light and protecting Confederate monuments and symbols. In its first two sentences, the Sons of Confederate Veterans charter document names the Magna Carta as being crucial to the political foundations of the United States. It says that the Constitution is, quote, the very Magna Carta of our liberties, and that as an organization, they, quote, adhere to the principles of the Great Charter of England granted at Runnymede in 1215, and the Anglo-Saxon rights and personal liberties transmitted to us thereunder. Drawing on the same, I think, sort of same use of Anglo-Saxon as Marjorie Taylor Greene is using, like Amy referred to earlier. So what they go on to say, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, is that, quote, Confederate ancestors by their sacrifice perpetuated onto us and our descendants that glorious heritage of valor, chivalry, and honor, which we now hold and venerate. In their core belief statements, they proclaim that white Southern society perpetuates the chivalric ideal of manhood. And they claim to be part of a, quote, long community of blood stretching back before the white settling of America to Northern and Western Europe, and obviously, as you might imagine, especially the British Isles. Okay, so I'm sort of wrapping up here. This is a conclusion. Just a couple more examples of what I'm talking about with neo-Confederacy and medievalism. So there's not a fine line between neo-Confederacy and white supremacy in America. It's quite a thin line. The two are inextricably linked and intertwined. There's unsurprising overlap between neo-Confederates and extreme right anti-government militias, whose members regularly espouse white supremacist beliefs. Amy kind of showed us some of these people, even if Amy's talked to address them directly, some of these people who were instrumental in assaulting the Capitol building on January 6th, like the 3%ers, which is a far-right anti-government militia movement in the US, whose members often open carry, I should say, long rifles in public spaces as a show of intimidation. I've seen them doing this. It's quite intimidating, I assure you. They demonstrate this enmeshing, this intertwining of white supremacy and neo-Confederacy. The Virginia Task Force of the 3%ers nicknames their group the Dixie Defenders. At far and extreme right rallies and gatherings, the Confederate flag and Crusader and medieval style icons and symbols fly alongside each other. So Confederate battle flags with Roman numeral 3, which is the 3%ers logo, emblazoned on them are common. And the Confederate flag is regularly displayed at 3%er rallies and protests. It's rife with medievalism. Their gear, I didn't really want to show it because I don't want to promote it, but like their gear that they sell is they brand themselves on t-shirts and patches and stickers and hats and license plates with Crusader imagery. They sport, logos with medieval helms. A significant portion of 3%er gear shows off medieval style stuff like the Crusader's cross or a Jerusalem cross, the hoodies with the 3 on a Crusader shield, that's what they call it, patches that read pork-eating Crusader with a red-eyed Knight Templar holding a piece of pork, and of course, Deus Vult, right, patches. There's a 3%er patch that reads time for another crusade. And so the two types of symbols, the Confederate flag and crusading, form part of the same white nationalist matrix of embattled victimhood for rural white Americans eager to project themselves, fighting this long battle for the last 150 years. I don't think that I should say that we should just discount these as puerile fantasies beyond the Capitol building storming. The FBI arrested in 2016 3 Kansas men who were members of a militia group connected to the Three Percenters on conspiracy charges for having plotted to blow up buildings that are home to many Muslim immigrants. And these 3 men called themselves, quote, the Crusaders. So, okay. Yeah, no, I'm like two sentences, I promise. I'll stop talking. Okay. Comparing far-right rhetoric about the Crusades with neo-Confederate rhetoric about the Civil War demonstrates how similar the roles are that both conflicts play for some on the political fringes. At far-right political rallies, on online forums, and at anti-immigrant marches, Confederate and Crusader symbols and outfits proliferate and mesh with each other. The costumes and symbols and memes have become so prevalent that even an American president's son, former American president's son, who defended the Mississippi state flag that contained a Confederate battle flag at the time, was photographed flaunting a rifle with a so-called Crusaders cross on it. Thanks, appreciate it. I hope that made some sense. I'm kind of in the process of drafting this article.
Thank you, Daniel. And well, thanks again to all 3 of you, Khalili, Amy, and Daniel. And I think this session, even if it was like coordinated and planned between you 3, it couldn't have been more fitting, because I think you 3 approached the subject from different themes and aspects, but it touched on very common ground. For example, between Amy and Kahalini, this idea that this sort of medievalism and this appropriations of the political, they first, I think, all 3, they pointed how it goes beyond medievalism and beyond medieval, and how it incorporates other elements, and they are fundamental to what we're seeing. But well, I'm talking too much. Let's open up for debate. If you have any questions for yourselves and comments and considerations, and then we can open to the chat and to the other participants.
Can I start?
Sure, go on.
Amy, I just want to say I just taught the conclusion to your new book to my medieval literature course on Tuesday, and they really liked it. And you kind of end that book with a really like positive vibe, basically. Not just a positive vibe, but like a positive message. You kind of are calling for us to sort of not just think of medievalism in this kind of dour or dreary way, like that some of our work, mine definitely included, sometimes does. I guess I was just kind of thinking really broadly about, how we address this. I know that's a huge question, but like you said that we need to be careful not to perpetuate white history. And I think that's a super important point. And I like that you're calling it white history. You're pointing to a really important issue, that this is not like what happened, right? These are very much myths and narratives about a white history, right? So like, how do we do that though? I mean, I know this is a broad question, but how do we not perpetuate white history? I mean, I just got done teaching a British literature course, and I was thinking about this all semester, right? Of like what can we do here as medievalists where we're not just perpetuating the same narratives over and over again?
That's a good question. And I'm sorry if I looked distracted while you were asking it. My cat busted my door open.
Oh, no worries. I can't move my chair because my cat is sprawled out beneath me.
Sorry. I think it has to be probably a number of solutions, right? If you're talking about in the classroom, it's about broadening the curriculum a little bit. I taught British history or British literature and European literature when I was still teaching. And because the curriculum was so strict, I had to sort of sneak things in from other cultures in order to make it fit. But I think, scholarship often trickles down to curriculum. And if we blow open our scholarship a little bit and start talking to people in other fields and have more collaboration and listen to other voices, I think that will help us stop being so Eurocentric. And sometimes that means reading outside your field. I know as scholars, we tend to think we don't have a right to trespass on somebody else's territory, but you and I are doing it with studying the Confederacy. We do it when we cross over into any other sort of culture. And because we're scholars, we can learn to do it, and we can listen to the voices of experts in those fields and converse with them and incorporate them into our work. So I think not being limited by specialty is important. I'm not saying like go trampling into, 18th century studies if you don't know anything about it and show up at their conferences and give talks, but listening is really important, following other scholars that aren't in your field on social media or reading their work and listening to them. I think that's really important. And I also think, and I know this isn't what you asked about, but it's been on my mind. I think that's important to the survival of the university, as an institution. I think the way we're so segregated into disciplines and fields is letting all this stuff where they axe whole humanities departments like they are at some universities here and in the States. It's letting it happen because we're isolated and we can't prove our relevance if we're isolated.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a great answer. I mean, I've been trying to do that a bit in my courses. It's definitely hard. So in my medieval literature course, one thing I taught this semester was the Tale of Genji, right? Which is definitely outside my wheelhouse. But, I think if you're just honest with your students about what you're teaching, I say to them when I started it, like, this isn't quite my area. I'll do my best to answer your questions. And I'm obviously like prepping for class. I've done my research, but like, I'm not a Japanese history scholar or literature scholar. So like, I'll do my best. I just think like, if you're kind of open and upfront with your students, they'll roll with you. I mean, they'll kind of try and make sense of it with you.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's funny, we feel like we have more permission, say, if you're hired as a medievalist at most universities, like you're also probably teaching Shakespeare, even though you weren't a Shakespeare scholar, right?
Oh yeah, which is me. I teach Shakespeare. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's about what we think of as teachable and learnable that I think needs to change.
Yeah, but even when you teach something like Shakespeare, like doing it in a way that is trying to do something that's interesting and new and engaging for the students. So I taught Othello, right? But then we read with Othello this really, really excellent article by a scholar named Ian Smith called "Speaking of Race in Othello." That's really excellent. That talks about Othello in the light of recent of police violence against unarmed Black men in the U.S. So there's ways of kind of expanding the conversation that I think are absolutely crucial.
Yeah, definitely. And now that more scholars are talking to the public, I think there's a rich trove of resources to connect students in, especially.
Yeah.
Just adding here, I think the equivalent of the medievalist teaching Shakespeare here in Brazil would be the medievalist professor teaching ancient history or modern history sometimes, or something else related. I think Andy had a comment as well, didn't you? Or did I misinterpret?
Me?
Yeah, I could be wrong.
I didn't.
Oh,
I
okay.
came up with one.
Okay.
Could I ask another question?
Go on.
I had a question for, I'm sorry, I don't want to mispronounce your name. Is it Carlile? Is that?
Carlile.
I don't think I'm doing that justice, but okay. So
no problem.
Okay. So I guess I'm just wondering, maybe this is a really basic question as an American asking this, but whether Bolsonaro is a symptom or a cause of upticks in medievalism, a right-wing medievalism in Brazil.
Just for a moment, Luis, can you translate for me, because my internet is out of order, is not working well, and I lost the last part of the question. And so you can translate to English for Daniel. please.
Ok, a pergunta dele foi se o Bolsonaro é uma causa ou uma consequência dessa crescida no medievalismo político, dessa ascendente aí.
Foi exatamente isso que eu entendi. Olha, é uma pergunta interessante. Eu não havia pensado nisso anteriormente, mas eu acho que ele é parte do contexto. Eu não diria que ele é a causa ou a consequência, mas ele é parte de um contexto maior. Mas ele potencializa algo que já existia antes dele. Conforme eu disse, esses lobos solitários, eles já estavam por aí. Eu acho que o Bolsonaro simplesmente os conectou. Thanks for your question, Daniel. Sorry to answer it in Portuguese, because I'm afraid to forget a couple of words and don't give a correct answer for you.
Oh yeah, no problem at all.
So
can you translate for us? Yes,
sure.
to English.
Translate the answer. Khalidi said he thinks Bolsonaro is a bit of perhaps the cause and the consequence, but he's a part of a greater context, let's say, because he is a part of a greater. Khalid, você pode só repetir a segunda parte do que você falou?
Eu acho que ele é parte de um grande processo e ele, de certa forma, não ele, mas o grupo político dele conseguiu conectar esses pontos, que eram esses lobos solitários, esses ideólogos que já existiam antes dele, mas a figura dele consegue uni-los.
Obrigado. So what he's saying is that he's not necessarily cause or consequence. He's a part of a larger context. And what happens is that his group or his supporters groups, they've managed to connect these different points and these different previously quote unquote lone wolves and group them under a more coherent discourse. So I'm using my own words here to make it to English, but I think that's the center of the answer, is how he's a part of this context. And so he is and now my words, I think he's I could say in English, he's catalyzing the phenomena.
That's interesting, thanks, yeah.
We have a question in chat here, so I think we should open now to questions from the public. Are you guys okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to start by Andrew Elliott dropped the question, so I'm going to read for him, which is, I have a question about the framework, which I think underpins all three talks, but particularly Amy's. Hard agree on the stop claiming medievalisms when they might come from elsewhere. As a professional imposter, I spend a lot of time teaching things I don't really know about, but I wonder if we miss the frameworks which produce and underpin those medievalisms. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I can jump in and answer first if you want. I think we do often miss frameworks, but that doesn't mean we can't know them. I think one thing about this kind of medievalism is that its meaning shifts, right, all the time, from 100 years ago to 1 week ago, depending on who is using it and how they're using it. And I almost think that being open to the fact that these meanings shift and the context shift is more important than a certain expertise in identifying medievalism. I think we get in trouble when we get fixed on pointing and I'll say as a caveat, I think people who have been doing medievalism studies for a long time, and that's pretty much everyone in this group, don't fall into this trap quite as much as people who are newer to it. But I think one of the problems is getting fixed on saying medievalism is here and it's bad, and then sort of walking away, right? Because then we don't understand why it's happening. And since most of us are concerned with preventing it, to the extent that we can, what we can do to kind of disrupt those narratives, because as the narratives change, the way that we intervene with them has to change too. I think maybe approaching these things with questions rather than with answers is important. Throwing out what you see to see what other people know, seeing what kind of connections you can make. And that can be uncomfortable because it means, our position as an expert, which a lot of us are required to have as professors, as scholars, gets a little bit disrupted. We have to be able to say, okay, I don't understand completely what's going on, and sort of outsource our understanding and see if we can figure it out. And we all know how to do research. So applying that to different communities is also important. Does that make sense? I'm a little caffeine deprived.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Thank you, Andrew. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Remember, you can also raise your hands so I can allow you into the conversation so you can ask your questions yourself. Or you can send them through chat or through the Q&A button. They all work finely.
I have a belated question for the other panelists. If I can jump in with one, which is, it's for both of you, is to what extent are the extremists you're studying in Brazil and the Confederacy, to what extent do you see them as educated? Carlila, you mentioned the books behind that one figure, and you were like, oh, well, we don't know if he's read the books or if they're just there for show. So to what extent are they pulling from official education as opposed to just internet knowledge?
Luis, please help me.
Okay, ela tá
I understood a little part, but I need your help.
Ela está perguntando sobre esses usos do passado aí que você mencionou, até que ponto eles estão sendo guiados ou embasados em história oficial ensinada, ou até que ponto isso vem mais de conhecimentos da internet?
It's a good question. Eu não tenho certeza. Sim, eu acho que há uma influência de grupos que trafegam pela internet e que se preocupam muito mais com uma estética medieval para dar legitimidade aos discursos deles, que são voltados para o presente. O uso desse passado é muito mais para construir uma estética legitimadora. E, de fato, o recurso... Aí, Luiz, eu vou apresentar uma palavra que você vai ter que traduzir. O recurso emocionalista, esse passado, o uso da emoção em detrimento da razão, que é sempre lenta, precisa de tempo. Essas pessoas usam essa estética com o objetivo de dar embasamento, um suposto embasamento histórico às ideologias deles, que trabalham com a emoção de um mundo perfeito que foi perdido. E estamos diante do fim, do final dessa história, e que esse passado irá ressurgir de forma grandiosa, um pouco naquele sentido de tornar a América grande novamente. Thanks, Amy, for your question, but I need to say again, I'm afraid to forget or lost 2 or 3 words and don't give a correct answer for you. Forgive me, please.
I understand. I couldn't possibly answer in Portuguese. So you're doing
so, and this is an opportunity, at least to me, to study a little more English, because it's a challenge for me.
Carline, eu posso, me corrija se eu estiver errado, mas disso que você falou, eu posso usar a palavra nostalgia, passado, uma nostalgia?
Sim, nostálgica, yes. Mitologização.
mitologização. Tá. Okay. So what he's saying is that he believes this discourses about the past, these narratives, they emphasize an emotionalist discourse and rhetoric, which is somewhat opposed to a more rational one, which is slower, because the emotional response is always quicker. So these people, they use and abuse aesthetics to give historical embasement or historical basis to their views, and create it as some sort of nostalgic and almost mythological past, and to create this idea of a past civilization, of days gone, and of make America great again, for example. So it wouldn't be as much official history, but it's more an internet history only.
That makes sense.
So we have
Could I-
someone,
could I- wait,
and
Daniel,
Daniel
just
was going
really
to start.
quick, if I could just add to that. Yeah, I just want to make the point, Amy. I noticed when you made that comment in your talk, I thought it was a really important comment about that these aren't just like necessarily, ignorant or totally uneducated people, and that I think it's a mistake. I agree with you. I think it's a mistake to think of all of them that way, as they're often portrayed on Twitter and in the media and whatever. But I just want to also make the point that, a lot of these, at least on my talk, and I think also in your talk too, Amy, a lot of these aren't just kind of like wingnuts, like out in, they are, but they're also espousing ideas that are fully supported by some of the most powerful people in our country. I mean, like by Congress people, by people who are on television every night, who are highly educated, and who know full well about the dangers and extent of what they're saying, but they say it anyway. And on top of which, I think that scholars also are, like I was pointing to one or two in my talk, like, I mean, this is an obvious point, but not all scholars are progressive, despite what the right-wing, right-wingers want to tell you. And we very much have, neo-Confederate scholars out there. And so it's not just like I agree with you, it's an important point, but it's not just the like education or non-education of the most obvious perpetuators of this kind of right-wing medievalism, but also how they're actually espousing ideas that are being supported by much more powerful people than them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not like a conspiracy theory. I mean, like Ted Cruz, I mean, like Josh Hawley, right? These kinds of people. This sort of speaks to a comment in the chat, but that by Daniela, but maybe we can get to that later.
Yeah. There is someone with the hand raised, which is Hawani, but I'm going to go to that comment first. So please just hold a second there with your hand up, because I think this comment that Daniel pointed out has everything to do, which is, what can we do when scholars feed such medievalism in an almost national nostalgic way? Some people consume it as real history just because they sell it as so, and to which I would add that I think there is also a risk here, and that I think almost all here have a background in medieval history, medieval literature, medieval studies in general, is that sometimes when we're trying to teach and present our subject, and we try to fight some misconceptions, for example, the idea of the Dark Ages, there is a dangerous pitfall of perhaps overly simplifying the idea and creating this myth of the Great Middle Ages. And I often see this in some classes, that the person I know, it's a colleague, I know he doesn't believe the Middle Ages were the best period in history, but they somehow convey this idea, even by accident sometimes, when trying to teach. So how should we respond to that? And what should we be careful about when trying to talk about the Middle Ages, not to present them as overly bad or overly good? And this is for all free, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just start by saying something kind of broad, but like I find it extremely difficult to teach political medievalism in my classroom, and I often just wind up not teaching it. It's not to say I don't talk about it at all, but my students, I feel, my undergrads have like no basis for understanding anything about the Middle Ages beyond Game of Thrones or whatever. And like, I just feel like by kind of even introducing like some of the more extreme aspects of political medievalism, you're putting yourself in a position where you're inevitably going to have students introduced to ideas that they probably shouldn't be, that I don't want to be responsible for introducing them to. And so it's a really kind of fine line, I think, that we have to toe between like how much of this actually should be presented to our students and how much of it should we just present to other scholars who have a good framework for being able to situate a lot of this material. It's not quite, I think, what the person is commenting on, but it's a sort of offshoot of it that I think is important.
So for me, I'm going to try to address two things. The first is what Daniel was talking about, bringing this into the classroom, what Luis mentioned. My philosophy when I was teaching was always to teach in a spirit of exploration rather than mastery, which meant that I would try to get students to explore medieval things and medievalism through an individual connection. So we would talk about sort of basic theoretical approaches to these things and basic modes of research. And then I would let them sort of take something they were interested in, whether it was video game or music or fantasy novel or something, and explore what was happening there kind of on their own with the framework that I'd give them, rather than standing up and saying, this is how it's being used. And, this is what's right. And this is what's wrong. I feel like, and this is sort of related to the original question, people need to come to answers on their own to understand it. That sort of top down telling someone what's right and what's wrong about the uses of the past can be alienating. And it can also, as Louis said, it can run the risk of oversimplifying, right? And selling the Middle Ages is either really great or really terrible, depending on the way that you're doing it. And as the original question about scholars, I'm sorry, I'm scrolling up and looking for it. What do we do about scholars who are selling these dangerous ideas of the Middle Ages, these sort of grandiose ideas of the Middle Ages? That is hard because often those scholars reach much larger audiences than we do, especially if our scholarship is speaking to other academics as opposed to being in the public sphere. And I think the only answer to that is to really flood the airways, right, with alternate information. You could go on an attack against that kind of scholar, but given the political climate that we're in, that will almost get them more attention than if you just sort of put out your own stuff and make it engaging and interesting. I did notice that Lucas had a question in Q&A, but if Carlila wants to answer this one, we could get to that next.
And we have someone with the hand raised first.
Okay.
I think there's a question for me.
Khalil, what do you mean? You want to comment on the question from Daniele, or not?
Oh no, I think he's saying there's a question for him in the chat.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yes, there's a question for me.
Okay.
I will answer. I'm going to answer in Portuguese, and you translate it to English.
Okay.
Eu agradeço quem enviou a pergunta. Eu penso que, pensando alto, eu penso que há de fato um grande número não um grande número, mas um número importante de editoras que perceberam que há um público que se interessa por esse tipo de publicação. Eu até agradeço a algumas dessas editoras que têm publicado alguns livros até interessantes, como, por exemplo, A Inveja dos Anjos, do Stephen Jagger. que é um livro que eu tinha em inglês, me ajudou muito à época da tese, e agora ele está publicado em português. Mas creio eu, repito, pensando alto, que se trata muito mais de uma estética medieval. Eu não tenho a certeza, ouvindo essas pessoas e caminhando aí por esses blogs desses grupos conservadores, se eles de fato leem esses textos. Eu penso muito mais que eles usam a imagem desses livros, essa estética medieval, para dar legitimidade ao que eles pensam. Um exemplo, há pouco tempo eu conversava com uma dessas pessoas e essa pessoa citou o Olavo de Carvalho. E muitos aqui sabem que eu fui orientado por um professor olavista no meu mestrado. Eu me envergonho disso, mas é a minha história. E eu acabei lendo, durante um período da minha vida, durante alguns meses, o Olavo de Carvalho. E eu percebi que a pessoa que debatia comigo não tinha lido o Olavo de Carvalho. Então é muito mais uma relação de consumo de uma imagem do que consumo de um conteúdo. E a imagem, numa época acelerada como a nossa, numa época em que vivemos uma modernidade tardia acelerada, então a imagem diz muito mais do que o conteúdo. Então, o oferecimento desses produtos para um grande público acaba seguindo essa lógica de a imagem legitimando, dando autoridade, e muito pouco conteúdo. Eu, por exemplo, não tenho certeza se as pessoas ligadas ao Instituto Hugo de São Vítor leem de fato o Hugo de São Vítor e têm conhecimento sobre a historiografia produzida sobre o Hugo de São Vítor e o Didascálio com as outras obras dele. Can you translate for us,
Sure.
Luis, please?
Sure. So what Khalili said is answering the question in the chat. He's grateful to these publishers for publishing these medieval works from philosophers and theologians, and that this is important work. The problem is that these works are used and appropriated by people to base this problematic ideas they have. And Carlini also points out that there is a relation of consumerism, perhaps, with these sources, more than of reading and dedicating time to understand them. And he gives an example. The example he gives is that he himself was, in his PhD, supervised by a professor who is a follower of Olavo de Carvalho. Not sure if Daniel and Amy know who Olavo de Carvalho is, but he's a Brazilian outright philosopher who currently lives in the US.
Yes.
And he is one of the intellectuals, quote unquote, behind this new far right here in Brazil. So he's somewhat of an intellectual Steve Bannon. They are friends, actually.
Yes.
Google it. Bannon goes to his house every now and then in I think it's Michigan. I could be wrong.
Olavo de Carvalho, Luis, please, excuse me. Olavo de Carvalho, I think he is the Brazilian Steve Bannon.
Yeah, he's the Brazilian Steve Bannon, as Carlini pointed out. But so what I was saying is, Carlini read Olavo de Carvalho. And once when he was arguing with someone about this, let's call it extreme beliefs, this person used Olavo de Carvalho as a theoretical example, to which Carlini realized, and my camera was turned off, Carlini realized that the person did not actually read Olavo de Carvalho. So he was quoting or referring to this already extreme author and perhaps a niche author, but he hadn't read it. So what Carlini points out is how this relation seems to be much more aesthetics, I guess, to show the books and to say, oh, according to Olavo, according to someone, instead of actually reading it. Espero ter traduzido tudo, Carlide. Foi muita coisa.
Exactly. Perfect.
Okay. Now I'm gonna give the words to Raoni, because he's been waiting for quite some time, and then we have a question as well. Raoni, you can unmute yourself and you can speak.
Right, you hear me?
Yep.
Right, my question is for Daniel, and I want to ask, how does that like medieval or new medieval imagery, aesthetics, and proposed moral code of an ideal society in this Neoconfederacy, how does it connect with the don't tread on me motto and libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, and so on? Because those things seem to be hailed in parallel among those groups and militias, with the same medieval imagery and aesthetics. And I want to know if it has something to do with the rebellious character of the Templars, which in some point rebelled against the church and made their own order. And well, that's the question.
Oh, yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, the Gadsden flag is, I mean, it's basically synonymous at this point with a Confederate flag, along with, let's say, like I don't know if this means anything to non-Americans, but like a Blue Lives Matter flag, right? Which is just for everybody, it's like an American flag where it's all black and white except for one blue line through it, which is, it's meant to be like a kind of supporting of police, basically, and a defense of police against accusations of violence and brutality, right? These things are thin blue, but it carries many connotations about, white grievance and what have you. So anyway, all these images like the Gadsden flag, the Don't Tread on Me flag, the thin blue line, the Confederate flag, and wrapped up in imagery of medievalism is, I think it's important to look at what Amy's saying too. It's just like, it's all kind of part of this sort of amorphous white history matrix of grievance and rebellion and just holding on to a kind of grip on power as they see it, against changing world that, like no compromise kind of thing, where it really is very much all rooted together in this kind of, in watching a kind of power, a sort of political power, of white America slipping away a little bit, not much. They're still in power. Don't lose any sleep for them. But I definitely, absolutely, yes, think it's all part of the same matrix of sort of white grievance and a kind of sense that their power is depleting.
Raoni, is that okay? Does that answer you?
Yeah, pretty much. I'd like to touch on another subject very briefly, if you allow me.
Go on.
I would like to ask if there is some visible like turning point for Neoconfederacy conversions of young people into their movements or militias or whatever, beyond that familiar influence, the heroic portrait of white men in medieval theme settings in the media, like series, movies, medieval fantasy books and stuff. Because it's at some point it is not clear how this thing is able to get so much into young people and in such barbaric acts like the invasion of the capital. Is there some turning point that is obscure, that is not observable, or something like that?
When you say conversion, do you mean like just a general idea that they become farther right or extremists or something?
I mean the phenomenon of like what will you look like a young guy that does not even have those extremist points of view or it's not ideologic, and sometimes it becomes like a a conversion, like a phenomenon of group conversion, even like people adhering to this rhetorics, to this ideology, and participating actively in these things, violent things even.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't studied that exactly, so I don't want to purport to have like knowledge or have done research on sort of like youth movements in particular with Neoconfederacy or even just like white supremacy in general in the US. So I don't want to like pretend to have done work I haven't. I will say that from the work that I've done and the, just following what happened on January 6th and what have you, it seems to me like the much broader audiences of Don't Tread on Me and Blue Lives Matter and Neoconfederacy and this whole matrix is an older crowd in general. I think that it skews towards like older white Americans and that they are probably, this is just a guess. I'm not like stating this as a fact. I'm just guessing that lots of younger Americans, even teenagers, like we're getting a little older, are probably getting a lot of the stuff from their parents, is my guess. I'm obviously like, we could talk about the internet and the influence of the internet and all that, but I don't think it should be dismissed that this is not like rebellious youths being more extreme than their parents. I think they're probably, a lot of their parents are probably getting them into this too, but that's a guess. I don't want to, I haven't studied this. I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
I can say a little bit about it, which is that at least the sort of, and some of this is from personal experience. So the modern neo-Confederate stuff and even the white supremacist stuff in the American South in particular, I think a lot of it connects more to September 11th and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan than we realize. I think one thing I saw, so I grew up in Florida, and the Confederate flag when I was growing up was something really only radical people had. It was not a thing. Like, you might find it in the backwoods or people whose grandparents were in the Klan or something, but it was not, flown everywhere. And I moved up north, and then I moved to Georgia to teach in what year was it? 2007. And those years in Georgia and Tennessee, I saw really steady escalation of the use of the flag and Confederate sentiments in combination with anti-Muslim activities. So I feel like I've mentioned this in other talks before, but the year I moved to Tennessee, they set fire to the Muslim Community Center, and there were twice, and there were a bunch of people with Confederate flags, rallying against the building of that center. They passed laws against Sharia law, as though that were something necessary to pass in Tennessee. And a lot of it came from fear and fear mongering after the attack on the Twin Towers. A lot of it also, particularly in the regions where I taught, came from people returning from those wars, which were endless. We're just now leaving Afghanistan, right? So for American kids, their lives revolved around that kind of antagonistic, anti-Islamic sentiment that Daniel was talking about, that sort of neo-crusade mentality. So that connection to the Confederacy. And I really can't wait to read your article. I can't wait until it's out, Daniel. But those connections, that sort of formed the background chatter of their lives, even before it went really big online.
Yeah, that's a good point, Amy. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Thank you, and thank you, Haoni, for the questions. Now, we have a question here in the Q&A. I think you can see it, Amy, but I'm going to read it out aloud just for the record, which is, to Amy, you spoke of white history as a conceptual tool to approach this phenomenon. If I understand it right, there is close connection with the quite broad theme of whitewashing the past, which surely is an issue regarding medieval history and therefore making it prone for such abuses by right-wing vulnerable whiteness. The question is, since both are connected, counteract them demands a joint effort, or because white history isn't proper history, confronting these persons with data wouldn't be enough?
And I hit the answer a lot. Okay. Two things here. One is that question of how we get through to extremists comes up all the time, and it's something on a lot of our minds. And I feel like it's very difficult to get through to an extremist directly. I think there are some rare cases of that happening, but being able to convince someone who's really emotionally invested in whiteness and the power and privilege of whiteness, it's almost impossible. But I think whenever I try to talk about it, I try to talk to the people around that person. You know, if you've got a racist student in the classroom, you're talking to the other students. And sort of show them a different version of history, something interesting, something that they can explore. I think it's important to condemn racism when it comes up, but I also think if you actually want to change minds, that kind of one-on-one, like smacking down bad racist medieval history when it comes up can only go so far. I think what you need to do is sort of educate the people who might see that racist stuff and not know any better, right? So that's kind of who we're talking to. Also, white history isn't proper history. This is the second part of the question. And yet it is taught like proper history in the United States, in Europe, in the UK, even in Brazil, right? That there is a real tension between scholars who promote this idea of white history, maybe without even meaning it, and people who are really trying to decolonize the curriculum and counteract it and speak against it. So saying that white history isn't proper history when you're trying to convince someone will only go so far, because like I said, they might have learned it from sources that they see as legitimate. And so then it becomes a question of your sources versus their sources, right? And your sources could be fake news, to steal a term. So I think somebody mentioned that we ended that book, I think it was you, Daniel, on a positive note. And I think in part that's because showing what's interesting and sort of positive and full possibility about the past can draw people in more than a kind of one-on-one attack.
I will say about that, just picking up on the last thing you just said, when I taught the conclusion to your book the other day, one of the books that we had read in my medieval literature course was Mandeville's Travels, right? Mm-hmm. Which is super interesting, of course, but and it's great to teach, but it's obviously really, really problematic, right? In many, many ways. And so I thought we had a great discussion about Mandeville, but one of my students said on Tuesday, when we got to the end of your book, and they were like, well, what should we do with someone like Mandeville, right? What is it supposed to serve as a kind of example for something? And I was like, well, no, not really. I mean, and so it was a good question. I thought they were just frustrated because on the one hand, it seemed like we were trying to, well, you, but then me through you, we're trying to promote the idea that the Middle Ages can help us think through, to help us decolonize the curriculum and think through a lot of these problems that you talk about in the book. But then when we teach medieval things that are super problematic, we have to sort of be like, but not that, right?
Yeah, I mean, the way I see something like Mandeville is as a way to understand, and I think I've always taught this way. I try not to teach morally, the morals should come from the student, right? And again, in the climate that we're in, it's important to condemn certain things, but someone like Mandeville, grossly anti-Semitic, wildly racist, also interesting in the way that learning how medieval people thought about themselves and thought about religion and thought about race and thought about all of that stuff. And so it's an insight. It's an insight into human psychology. And what you do with it is, we're scholars, right? We're not making policy. We hope that some of the people we educate will go out and make that policy. But what we do with it is we analyze and we understand ourselves, and we understand where a lot of our misbeliefs and biases and things like that come from.
Yeah, no, totally. That's a good answer or a good response. And like also, I just want to underscore what you were saying before about like when you get a racist student or students who say crazy shit, basically. I mean, I don't necessarily, that does happen once in a while in my courses, especially in like a medieval course, but I don't really feel like my goal at that point is to make this person stop being racist. My goal is to make sure that everyone else in the class understands why what they've said is problematic, right?
Exactly.
And to offer them a different way of thinking about it. So I'm really there for, I'm just underscoring what you're saying before. I feel like my role in a classroom when that happens is to help everyone else out rather than that particular person.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Just a minute. Let me check if we have more questions here. Zoom is on my way. Okay. We do have a question, and then I have a question myself. But first, let me go for these two questions in the chat. Oh, they're actually the same. So it's from João Batista. I would like to ask if, when we historians question historical discourses and certain historical facts, if we are not feeding the arguments of the deniers, how to avoid this problem? So by deniers, you mean like negationism? But yeah, this is the question. Who wants to start?
I have a take on this, although I feel like I'm always talking. So if somebody else wants to go first, that's fine. Okay, so I feel like, and you can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, this question is sort of about positivist versus postmodern history. So whether we look at history as something that we teach facts from versus something where truth is relative. And there have been scholars in the last 10 or 20 years who have said, you know, part of the reason we are in the predicament that we're in with all these relativist uses of the Middle Ages is that scholars taught everyone that the truth doesn't exist, right? And that history is relative. And when we make those points about bad and wrong history, what we're really doing is disrupting the idea of history itself and saying that is something unstable and that it can never be known. And so whatever your version of history is right for you. I think that is where the question is sort of going, but I don't necessarily agree with that. I can see the point, but I think we have to get people to treat history as though it's not a sacred object without letting them believe that you can just pick and choose whatever you want from history. It's a balance, right? History is polyvocal. It's a lot of different voices speaking. And I think what history has done up until recently is privileged a single voice. But if we can teach history as a kind of polyvocal, multifaceted phenomenon from a bunch of different perspectives, that's not the same thing as saying there's no one true history or that, you know, certain things didn't happen. I think it's important to balance those two things, if that makes sense.
Can I jump in? I completely agree with Amy's take here. That was also how I understood the question. I teach a book sometimes in class called Post-Truth by Lee McIntyre, and I like it in general, and it works well in the classroom. But I really dislike McIntyre's chapter on postmodernism because he says basically what you've characterized is just like, you know, so-called left-wing scholars have been saying for decades now, you know, since maybe like the 80s or whatever, that, you know, truth is relative and nothing is really like can be known and that sort of thing. And I kind of disagree with that. I don't feel like that's really what postmodernist scholars have ever really said. I don't think they've said that facts are debatable. Like, so I'm just picking a random name. Foucault, I don't think argues that like facts are relative. I think he would, you know, like, yeah, the American Revolutionary War started in 1775. That's not a truth that can be debated, right? I think when they talk about truth, postmodern scholars, they're really talking about like Amy said, interpretations of narratives, which is not at all the same thing to when we talk about facts or whatever, right? So I completely agree with Amy that like questioning frameworks and narratives and rethinking frameworks and narratives is exactly what we should be doing as historical scholars. You know, I don't think that then translates into like whatever you want to say is fine, and whatever history you want to kind of come up with is totally fine. It's two totally different things. I mean, the one is exactly what historians should be doing, in my opinion, or anyone who studies the past. And the other is, you know, just kind of a right-wing talking point, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's a cynical talking point. I think, you know, that sort of language about relativism was co-opted by the right wing in the 90s, you know, in the early aughts, and it was done on purpose because there was an opportunity there to sort of disrupt progress.
Okay.
Luiz, please. Muito simples, e eu acho que devemos continuar ocupando esse espaço virtual que nós não ocupávamos até há pouco tempo, mas pensar como ocupar esses, como dar o passo seguinte, que é usar melhor essas ferramentas e construir novas linguagens, porque os negacionistas estão aí. Eles não vão deixar de existir porque nós queremos. Eu acho que é, pelo menos, participar desse admirável mundo novo e tentar oferecer os nossos préstimos, e não simplesmente negá-lo, conforme a gente fez há algum tempo. Eu acho que, neste sentido, a pandemia, se há alguma coisa positiva nela, é que nós nos movimentamos e criamos as nossas redes. Mas como agora saber usar e construir novas linguagens que sejam pelo menos de uma alternativa a essa cultura negacionista tão poderosa que formou uma espécie de um ecossistema dentro da internet. Please translate for us.
Okay. Professor Carlili points out that if there is a positive point, if it's even possible to say that about the pandemic, is that we have started to occupy more this public virtual space. And therefore, we are reaching audiences that we haven't before. But he also emphasizes that, okay, we should continue to do that. That's important. But we should also start thinking about the next step, which is how to best use these tools and languages, which are new to us most of the times, because the negationists and, well, the other appropriators of this history, they are there, and they are going to continue there, despite we wanting it or not. So it's not just about denying them like we did in the past and refuting them. We have to think about the next step and to how to use this language as well as they do. Khalid, tudo so we have only 4 minutes left. So I have one very brief question for both Amy and Carlili, which is on one thing Amy mentioned about the how some of this QAnon is not a traditional conservative right-wing movement only, and also how, we see Q Shaman and he's actually appropriating native North American things. So how these people, the stereotypical right-wing conservative neo-medievalist is someone from a Christian background, and the idea of the Templar and that sort of thing. But at the same time, we have some movements that thread dangerously to the left and to other directions, if that even exist. And a brief example I will give here is that some sectors of the Brazilian left wing did support Donald Trump for re-election here by saying, the election is rigged, and by repeating most of QAnonist arguments. So how do we deal with that? And what is the danger of generalizing political medievalism as being a conservative right-wing problem only? So that's the question for you both, or you three.
Yeah, so there were also people on the political far left in the US who supported Trump. And it's a real problem. And it's called, sort of in political rhetoric, it's called Horseshoe Theory, meaning that the far left and the far right come together at a certain point where their ideologies overlap. You say the same thing in transphobia in the United States. So you might see some very, very far left radical feminists teaming up with radical Christian conservatives in their opposition to transgender rights. So I think the way to deal with it is to make space for it in our analysis, because not only will the people who want to argue with us come out and say, but look, you know, I see like, I saw a bunch of medieval Bernie Sanders memes in 2016, which, you know, I never did anything with, and they certainly weren't all as mean-spirited as the Trump memes, but some of them were. There was one going around in 2016 that had a picture of Gandalf and Bernie Sanders and some other fantasy characters that said, sometimes you just need an old white man for president in 2016. So I think it might actually help if it didn't seem like we were always just attacking the right, and we were able to sort of neutrally look at everything that's happening in the whole political sphere. And I also think it's really important to analyze the leftist, the very far leftist obsession with whiteness, with sort of anti-globalism, because all of that opens people up to the other side, that right-wing hatred.
Okay, Carlini, and we have to finish this, so.
No, can you translate for me just the last part, because I forgot.
Oh, the last part, ela falou que a gente tem também que ficar de olho na obsessão que a esquerda tem, às vezes, com supremacia branca. Sim. Também, com o passado branco.
Sim. Rapidamente, embora eu tenha trabalhado muito como a direita se refere ao passado medieval e como usa politicamente, a percepção que eu tenho que não é só a direita que faz esse tipo de uso, a esquerda também. Há uns 2 ou 3 anos, durante a reforma trabalhista aqui no Brasil, eu vi vários memes utilizando iluminuras medievais, mostrando como o trabalhador era explorado na Idade Média e que voltaríamos com o fim dos trabalhistas no Brasil à Idade Média. E eu escrevi um texto, um ensaio, que foi publicado há algum tempo, usando até aquele meme, tentando mostrar, explorar a possibilidade de dialogar com os estudantes, mostrando aquele meme como a esquerda o ressignificou e mostrando que a vida do camponês da Idade Média não era tão ruim se comparada, por exemplo, à vida do trabalhador das indústrias, já com a Revolução Industrial. Então, a esquerda também usa o medievo, mas agora é um fato que no atual contexto, e sobretudo no contexto brasileiro e americano, e lembrando que hoje eles ocupam o poder, pelo menos nos Estados Unidos ocupavam até pouco tempo, eles se fazem muito mais presentes, o discurso deles tem muito mais força, porque eles estão hoje no poder. Mas a esquerda também faz uso do passado medieval. Luiz, no final, me dê apenas 1 minuto para eu fazer um convite, por favor, depois, no finalzinho, antes de encerrar.
Okay, so just translating what Carlini said, he mentioned that although he works mostly with the far-right perception, it is not only the far right that appropriates this medieval past. And he mentions as an example, a couple of years ago during the the reformation we had here on workers' rights, there were a lot of memes using medieval illuminations and showing like, oh, take a look at how these peasants were oppressed and they had to work all day. And this is what we're going to do now that we have no worker rights in Brazil. And he mentions that, of course, this far right uses, especially nowadays in Brazil, in the US, in which they have been in power or at least endorsed by people in power, they are much more tangible and shocking. But there is a appropriation by the left as well. With that, I unfortunately have to end this amazing discussion, but I'm sure everyone here is willing to continue it another time, because we are already 3 minutes on the next table, to which I invite all of you, which would be about theory, teaching, and medievalism. And also Professor Carlini wants to do a small invitation. Go ahead.
Thanks, Luis. Now in English. Next Friday, not tomorrow, next week, May 7th, in 7:30 p.m. the Brazilian time, it will happen my new book release. Is that correct, Luis? Release? Is that correct?
Yep.
My new book release, and I'd like to invite you, Luis, Amy, and Daniel, and all the people around the world. It will be happen on Vivarium, Vivarium channel on YouTube. Okay, did you understand me? The link is attached.
You can send the link to me. You can send the email invitation to me. Then I can send it to everyone in the conference.
Awesome.
Okay, so bye-bye, people, and see you in the next room starting now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.